I'm John Altman, Emeritus Professor at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University and Adjunct Professor at the Jumbana Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology, Sydney. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Wairarong and Bunurong communities of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we in Melbourne, or Narm, are meeting this evening. I pay my respects to their ancestors and elders, past and present. As of 1 January this year, over 50% of Australia's landmass is held under Indigenous title, with many Indigenous communities providing vital ecological and climate mitigation services for the benefit of the nation. This is most apparent on 78 Indigenous protected areas that make up half the Australian National Reserve System. Despite this terrestrial estate, the ability for First Nations communities to continue to protect their country and contribute substantially to Australia's climate emergency response remains heavily circumscribed. How can this still be the case in 2021? That is the broad question that our panel of 3 exceptional experts will address this evening. What legal reforms and investments are needed to properly support Indigenous landholders to manage their country in accord with their customs and traditions, and to facilitate real opportunities for urgent climate repair? So, to the first of our speakers. Cato Muir is Deputy Chair of the National Native Title Council. He is a Wati, a Goldfields Aboriginal cultural and community leader, and an anthropologist and archaeologist with many years of experience working in Aboriginal heritage, language preservation and maintenance, and on ecological, educational, and native title research issues. He is a board member of the Native Title Services Goldfields and chair of the Wakamaru Aboriginal Corporation, the prescribed body corporate for the Munta Rutinia Native Title Determination. Cato is a community-based cultural heritage and environmental activist, and like me, he's a director of Original Power. Cato's focus today is on how native title might work for conservation and climate. Please welcome Cato Muir.
So I'll start just by the formal acknowledgements both of fellow panel members, Nolan and Emma, and of course you, John, and also acknowledge and recognising the various First Nations lands on which we currently sit and participate in this event. So I'm in my hometown of Leonora. We are out in the deserts of Western Australia, in the Goldfields region, but on the edge of the Goldfields region in the desert. And so I'll acknowledge my fellow countrymen. Mostly we identify as Wangata people, but we also have Mardu, and a lot of us identify as Ngani Dara, Yanango, Anango, the whole range of other names and identities. But essentially we come from the Western Desert Cultural Bloc. And in our Western Desert culture, we are, so where I sit now is perhaps the last of the parts of Australia to be colonised and settled by the British and subsequently the Australian settlers. My grandparents walked out of the bush along with my mother, and we have lived and occupied that space in the frontier zone, I suppose, the transition between the settler society and the traditional Aboriginal societies. And in the context of this discussion, I think it's worth noting that we have completely different worldviews. the settler society is built on the foundation of the Abrahamic religions and the views that God created the heavens and the earth and all of that. And the position of humans or mankind in that space is quite different to how myself, my countrymen, and other Indigenous peoples view our relationship and our role with the environment. Where I come from, we look at the Jogurba as the source or origin of creation, and the actions of our ancestral spirit beings who have undertaken their, lived out their lives, performed their deeds, established the laws and the customs and the traditions. And in so doing, we have formed a relationship with the environment and other creatures in it on kinship basis. So I am kin with, species. And I think a lot of other Indigenous peoples and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in particular share these kinship relationships with the environment, with other species, and even with forces and actions of the environment. And so one of the biggest breakthroughs, I think, in reasoning or understanding is that when the Aboriginal people suffered the genocide, the massacres, and the removal from country, our role as the sustainer and the maintainer of the balance disappeared. And our custodianship or stewardship also was diminished. And thereby, a lot of our family, our kin in the animal world have disappeared. We were no longer able to maintain the tabia, the rituals, the ceremonies to maintain the flow of those energies. In the post Mabo native title era, the First Nations of Australia and our various cultural dimensions are coming back to play an active role in maintaining and sustaining our environments. So as was mentioned earlier, 50% of the Australian landmass, and I would suggest even beyond that, to one date where most of the Australian landmass will have some form of either ownership, management, or consultation rights of Indigenous peoples. The various impacts, the bushfires, which from an Aboriginal cultural perspective, a bushfire is our friend. And bushfires are a useful tool to sustain the environment, maintain the resources, and keep things tidy. Sadly, in the post-settler era, or the post-colonial era into the settler era, our role in bushfires had reduced, and therefore lands were not managed and supported the way they could otherwise have been managed. That's just one example. I could go into also the drought. We have a very highly developed science, which is dressed in spirituality, rituals, performance, art, songs, dance, connections to country, each of which operates on the vibrational level of being able to bring rains. And I'm looking at Nolan over there. For a lot of us people in the desert, we have these relationships with his people, the Bardi people, and others up in the North Kimberley coast, who, without whom we would not get rain out in our part of the world. And this may sound quite esoteric to listeners and everyone else, but what I am wanting to do in my presentation here is to ground our awareness in that cultural and spiritual dimension and look at that as the basis on which many First Nations people interact with the rest of the world. We have a authority and a connection that goes back many thousands of years if you're counting the clock, or in our worldview, back to the Jogurba, back to creation. In that space, incidents like Jukan Gorge, and I should also say the Apache people at Oak Flats in the United States and other First Nations peoples around the world, we struggle to maintain these responsibilities and these support for all living forms in an environment where there is an economy built around extraction, exploitation, marginalisation, and lies on the account books. So, you know, if you were to properly audit and account for the true cost of a lot of the extractive and exploitive industries, those endeavours would be bankrupt. So incidents like Jukan Gorge and Oak Flats and the litany of other offences against the cultural and spiritual integrity of our lands needs to stop. The report never again should actually mean never again. It should not mean never again until the next time. And sadly, we seem to be heading into the next time. So wrapping all that up in the full context of where we are. So I've just recently taken on the role as chair of the National Native Title Council. We support and lobby and act on behalf of prescribed body corporates, who are the traditional owners of lands across Australia. And these are really the forums in which a lot of these conversations, relationships need to be nested. There are a number of PBCs at the moment who are engaging in renewable energy production projects, solar power, delivering power to the extractors and the exploiters, the mining industry. Unfortunately, we have these big challenges. And the challenges are PBCs don't get adequately resourced or funded by the federal government. We have a huge and major responsibility to play on land, and we need adequate resourcing. And the other big ticket item, of course, is free, prior and informed consent, and the capacity of traditional owners, First Nations peoples on lands to have that say over what activities occur on our lands, how those activities occur, and also to put in place the protections so that if you do the exploitation or the extraction in particular, if you do the extraction, you do it in a way that we are comfortable with, that we also support, because we do know how to take resources from the land in a sustainable manner that then contributes to the empowerment of our people, the environment, and our culture.
Thank you very much, Cato. Much food for thought. Our second speaker is Nolan Hunter. Nolan is the former CEO of the Kimberley Land Council. He has spent over 13 years working for the Kimberley Land Council in native title and advocacy on Indigenous issues. Nolan is a Bardi man with strong ties to his people and culture across saltwater country in the Kimberley in northwestern Australia. He is an active campaigner for Indigenous rights to own and manage country, supporting advocacy that links international perspectives to Indigenous land justice and the rights of Aboriginal people. Speaking from an institutional perspective, Nolan will ask, how might we reform native title to empower traditional owners. Please welcome Nolan Hunter.
Yes, thank you, John. Look, I will start by acknowledging that I'm on Noongar Whadjuk country here in Western Australia in the south, down in Perth, and also acknowledge Cato, Muir, and Emma Lee, our other panel members, including yourself, John, and of course your respective people and areas. And I pay my respects accordingly to people's ancestors and their leaders and their future people, particularly for the lands in which we are all on. And I do so acknowledge that. Look, before I head off on the question that John asks around institutional mechanisms, I might just start off by making a couple of points. One is about international benchmarking. And I just talk about the notion that, the world's 5% of Indigenous peoples have responsibilities for management of, custodianship of, stewardship of, ownership of a quarter or more of the global landmass, which equates to 80% of the world's biodiversity. I'd also like to acknowledge that the Paris Agreement actually acknowledges Indigenous people, particularly in relation to their rights, which is it's the first time that it's been recognized in a legally binding instrument in the UNFCCC. So we were quite pleased about that. I want to talk about the fact that in terms of benchmarking and the international engagements, that the notion of global knowledge sharing with other Indigenous people on cultural traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge, and Western science. And some examples of that are the International Savannah Global Emissions issues, where I think it's something like 2 gigatons annually. And so how Indigenous people are playing a part in Australia, in Northern Australia, going over there to share knowledge and to, teach them how traditional knowledge, Aboriginal traditional knowledge works around the management of fire. And that's an exciting project supported by Foreign Affairs with Botswana and the East Kimberley mob back home, and supported by the International Savannah Fire Management Initiative. And so I acknowledge Sam Johnston and also Ariadne Goring, who had a big part to play in that while we were doing a lot of that work for the Kimberleys and for that relationship. And I want to talk about the Australia's international land reserve system of 17%, and the significant proportion of that being made up of Indigenous protected areas and Aboriginal people playing a big role and a big part in that. And of course, John has made mention, but the recognition that Australia's landmass with native title, but not only native title, but there are some freehold, partial leases, and other types of land tenure in excess of over 50% of Australia's landmass that is under the control, management, and stewardship, etc., of Aboriginal people in Australia. That's quite significant. One of the other things that I'd like to talk about is the notion of looking to means by which Aboriginal people in Australia, if you recognise that Indigenous people, in the first point I made globally, are really particularly vulnerable, being those in areas of high impact from climate change impacts. And therefore, what is it that they can do proactively? I mean, the fire and the carbon abatement stuff was some examples. One of the things I like to also point out is that how do we empower Aboriginal people to keep up the obligations? And Cato mentioned the relationship and our spiritual connection to our lands and all the obligations we have as Aboriginal people. And therefore, how do people then take care of that land and build their capabilities and capacities by looking at other models that, for example, business or enterprise models, where they can generate income to then have greater resources to manage lands and conservation and biodiversity. So, there's all these good stories talk about how Aboriginal people can play a part in this, not just in terms of the token value, but some really proactive moves out there around that fits with our cultural connection to land and looking after country. So Aboriginal people, that point I made about capacity vulnerability and what is it that we do to take care of that. From the context of native title, we know, even before that, we know that vulnerability in Australia is significantly highlighted. If we're talking about an evidence-based analysis around health and ABS statistics and poor social and socioeconomic indicators already point out that Aboriginal people have to struggle. And I point out that Cato mentioned and talked about some of the frameworks where people are struggling around the protection of their lands, whether it's native title or the cultural obligations that they have around the destruction of cultural heritage sites, where what you actually see is that legislation on native title in the one instance gets a recognition which doesn't hold up when there's an overriding legislative framework that can come in and offer no protection to that destruction for Aboriginal people. And the other point that's quite significant is native title does not also recognise other Aboriginal people, which is wrong. And their input and their obligations and responsibility as Aboriginal people, spiritually and otherwise and culturally, to land and their connection is just as important as everybody else. So there's a structural issue around native title that needs to be fixed. So if I just talked about native title, I would say that structurally, native title is a design fraught with difficulty. If you recognise that Australia finally recognises that Aboriginal people were dispossessed of their lands, and then they create a system that says you have to now prove you were dispossessed of your lands. So they create a law called native title. That native title law has all of its issues, but it does create procedural rights. And there are problems if I'm talking about identifying what is it that prevents Aboriginal people from being able to look after country for, and the example of the legislative framework around the heritage protection and destruction that we heard of with Juukan Gorge. There were other scenarios across the whole of Australia where Aboriginal people's cultural and heritage protected areas aren't being looked after or being overridden by existing statutes, legislations, and other types of policies. Native title, the burden of proof in native title is very high, and it can cost anywhere up to $1 million or more over a 14 to 20 year period. So basically, if we're talking about Aboriginal people being able to manage their lands, look after their obligations, and protect, in terms of adaptation being a key factor that's raised in the Paris Agreement, to look after the lands and manage some of that in the way that they can with their cultural and traditional knowledge and other means, that they are being tied up in a process that goes for so long, is so expensive. And we look at saying, well, what are the answers when we look at this? But we recognize that that's got to be taken into account. And native title, once it has been delivered, it's not a proprietary right, but it does give you recognition. It does give Aboriginal people recognition. We talked about, and Cato mentioned this as well, that the benchmarking that we needed to do around the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples is an example, UN free, prior and informed consent. We know that the Australian government endorsed the UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, back in 2009 with the Rudd government. So there are enablers and there are processes that could work if people, through whatever means, in different tenures across Australia, have such a high proportion of management or responsibilities in biodiversity, environmental and land management. So that's a positive in that sense. But what probably needs to happen is, if we wanted to talk about what was the issue about Aboriginal people being able to do what they need to do, given all of the challenges, whether it's the statutes or the socioeconomic and social conditions, that they need resources, they need capacity, they need capability, they need a whole range of things. So if I think about native title, I thought about Justice French made a recommendation that said it should be incumbent on respondent parties to disprove native title, as opposed to Aboriginal people having to prove native title. So I think that's worth considering, on the basis that when you look at these huge costs and you think about, okay, what are the capacity building issues around resources and around how do we help people who have these responsibilities? Right there is, if you think about it, the first half of the native title process over 25 years or more has been the settlement of 300 claims at a cost of God knows how many millions. When you think about what I've said about each claim cost, there is still over 300 more claims or something very close to it that should take, if you think about the delays and everything else, the evidence threshold, which is quite so high, will take quite as long. So the real question isn't about saying the system is broke. Yes, it is. But the real question is saying if the capacity and capability of Indigenous people could be improved. I think this is one of the ways why you would want to, or think about how you could reform existing mechanisms or institutional practices, which was the initial part of John's question. And the heritage stuff I've already mentioned is about saying that the weakness or the test on the native title is that it can easily be overridden by state legislation or any other legislation for that matter. So it has its vulnerabilities in that sense. But if I was to take the positive point, it says if there is a recognition, and it's still, despite all of those challenges and those barriers, it does not prevent us from asserting these responsibilities and creating some really good outcomes in Australia's targets around emissions reductions through the management of wildfires, or reduction of emissions or carbon, etc. There are other things, and I talked really about identifying as aggressive land tenure reform strategies that disempower people sometimes. And so one of the things, I guess I'm the converse of this identification of this as a point, is that it understands that what are the things that you need to change in order to empower people to have the capability, further control and capability around the management of their lands or their connections or their responsibilities. We've seen where there are joint management or Indigenous land use agreements, or people going through a process, if it takes you 14 years or whatever, then being put under pressure to hand over that control. The joint management processes that is what I would call an sometimes inequitable arrangement. But basically, I'm identifying key issues where I think there could be improvements, particularly in light of the fact that you can't allow somebody to go through this whole process, being dragged through the federal court, and then say, by the way, now that you have this recognition, hand it over and give it to us to manage, and all those types of things. So look, I'm kind of talking more about the problems of native title, and I've gotten that off my chest. But now I guess that also forms part of the solution, I guess. And we talked about, I talked about benchmarking and how people are empowered. How does Australia need to have regard to that, on the basis that Aboriginal people, the point about land holdings or responsibilities for major landmass areas, are significant factors that Australia can have regard to in terms of the way it prioritizes the support to Aboriginal people to do these things. And what else did I talk about here? Look, I think that those are the main points I wanted to make. It was more about saying, recognize the value, recognize internationally if they're saying that, and I'm saying here, recognizing the value of Aboriginal people in climate change. And Australia, if it understands the value that Aboriginal people are creating, not just at home in Australia, but also internationally. Some of the examples, knowledge sharing, there are other ones, and I've just mentioned one. But, this is value for Australia if the answer is that the solutions are in saying who plays a role in addressing climate impacts, then that societal construct there. Regional modelling, like your Pacific Island Marine Reef Management, or your Aboriginal people doing fire and carbon management, or there's other examples of those models as well. I think there's enough of a case and enough of evidence there to support that there's some real value that could be further embraced and embellished and developed, so that people will be playing a major part in supporting the world's addressing of the impacts of climate change, particularly Indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nolan. That was a very wide-ranging and terrific to bring in the international perspective. Our third speaker is Dr. Emma Lee. Emma is a Trawulwoi woman of Tebragana country in northeast Tasmania. She's a research fellow at the Centre for Social Impact, Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. Emma's research fields over the last 25 years have focused on Indigenous affairs, land and sea management, policy and governance of Australian regulatory environments. Her work in Tasmania has assisted in constitutional reform, the first joint management plan of a protected area, and establishing a market for cultural fisheries. In 2021, Emma became the first Indigenous Australian editor of the Best Practice Guideline for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. Emma will discuss what approaches have been used in regions like Tasmania where there are no legally recognised native title rights. Please welcome Emma Lee.
It's so wonderful to be here in the company of my elder uncles. I'd love to shout out to the Kulin Nations mob there in Melbourne, in particular you, Vicky, and a shout out to elders, ancestors, emerging leaders on all lands where we stand today. For me, that's coming from Nangneeki Plu country here in Tasmania. Okay, so I'm Aboriginal Tasmanian, and if there's one thing you know about us, it's the fact that we don't exist. 1876, upon the death of our magnificent countrywoman Trukanini, our peoples were declared extinct, exterminated, no more. So it's very hard to get native title when you're not even considered a peoples. And we have to start somewhere. And our people certainly have never given up. The advocacy to not only say that we are here, we exist, we are alive, but we still have our knowledges and we still have our connections to country. And 2010, the decision was made to destroy a 40,000-year-old site in Tasmania to put in a bridge that would reduce the trip into Hobart by about 10 or 15 minutes. And so we understand the pain of having your family, your ancestors, your story, your blood, your heart being torn away from you. This thing for convenience. And so when you don't have a voice because you don't exist, it's very hard to try and use a national one-size-fits-all legal system to gain our rights. I tried something a little bit different with a small group of my elders, community people, in about 2013. One of the things that you read about Indigenous peoples and being Aboriginal Tasmanian, I can certainly tell you that generally in the history books, there's not a whole heap that's good written about us. In the media, it's always these negatives, this deficit around what we aren't and what we should be in other people's eyes. Sort of sadness around the other people's view of us. And yet, when you stand here on the other side of it, you know our peoples and our communities to be full of love. Full of love for our elders, our ancestors, our country, our community. You do not know joy until you see an old auntie kicking up their heels because they're in country and going on a collecting tour. To hear that grand sigh of contentment from our old uncles when they're at peace in country. And so Tasmania is quite a unique place in the sense that we have now wiped out all the Aboriginal people. But on the other hand, we also have 48% of our landmass as a protected or conserved area, which is national parks, forestry reserves. So there's a heck of a lot of land in Tasmania country that is held by the Crown. We can't access through native title. So a couple of aunties, myself, a few other community people as key architects in 2016 of a whole of government strategy entitled Reset the Relationship. Reset, I'm so glad that we were ahead of the curve on that buzzword. But it's true. When the governance of a relationship is so bad, it causes harms to us in every aspect of our lives, then we have to go back and reset the violent relationship. And so we adopted a methodology called love bombing. We went to a Liberal government who had just been voted in 2014, and we said, we love you. Thank you for your genocide. Thank you for your dispossession. Thank you for your exile. We love you. Does that make it an easy entry point into beginning deep relationships with us? Because the fear and the fumble and the fatigue of the entry points into establishing a relationship with Aboriginal peoples can be seen as really fraught for some. We get bogged down in a culture war. And so things like the climate emergency happens around us while we're sort of tiptoeing around on eggshells or being very strident in our opinions that, you can't be Aboriginal because we killed you all off. And so we love bomb this government. We love you. We gave them a sense of cultural love. We gave them a sense of belonging to who we are, kinship love, so that in being able to give gifts to ministers and senior heads of agency and the decision makers about our country, being able to impart that story about why this kelp basket is important because we're losing our kelp forests, or why this shell necklace is becoming so much more rarer, that there was a personal connection to it. And this was generally led by the elders, that being on country love, come out with us, come and listen to our elders. know that we want to see each other as brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles, so that we can make decisions together. And this comes out as a form of kinship love that defined a case study over the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, which is about 1/5 of Tasmania's landmass, about 1.6, 1.8 million hectares. It's massive. And so a statutory plan for Wilderness World Heritage was out of date come 2014. And the efforts that we made to show that this isn't wilderness, it's not pristine, it's not untouched. It has been loved, it has been cherished, it has been cared for, it has been connected with for 40,000 years. We believe that there is room for love, room for the cultural and spiritual connection of country to be centred in how we manage it together. And so joint management for us was about plural dialogue for mutual benefit, deep, respectful listening to each other and engaging in reciprocal activities. And anyway, we got our first joint management plan. And out of that joint management plan, because the consultation was so good, there was all this free, prior and informed consent from our peoples, there was a celebration and a joy, love for country, love for who we are in our regions, that it actually, the Liberal government was so impressed by this that they linked joint management plan to constitutional reform. And so in January 2015, on the back of the draft plan of management, the then Premier just said, I think constitutional recognition sounds about right. And this went through one parliamentary inquiry, 2 houses of parliament, and 23 months later, the governor, our precious and beautiful governor of Tasmania, is signing a royal assent that gave us rights and preamble to our state constitution that Aboriginal Tasmanian people are First Peoples and traditional owners of our lands and waters. What a miracle. We have raised ourselves up from our status of not being human nor alive. And out of this sense of dialogue through kinship has translated into my belief and my partnership of working with Indigenous Voice to Parliament on the National Co-Design Group. Because it's not just enough to have an arena and the right to speak, because sometimes speaking is all that we are left with. What we need is a relationship. What we need is an ongoing satisfaction that we are being heard and considered. And so Indigenous voice is necessary and needed for us to be able to have a formal and legitimate say in the affairs that affect us. It would be my grandest wish that the destruction of our heritage and our ancestors and our law does not continue, but it has regardless, because we don't have these formal networks. And so for me, climate change and our beautiful Black responses to it is relationship-based. For me, this is not about anxiety. For me, this is about love. And the fact that we say when we are connected to country, we've got this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. from that perspective from Tasmania. We've certainly had a wonderful diversity of views. And now let me turn to the panel. Should we be agitating to strengthen native title with free, prior and informed consent rights and with commercial rights? Or is there a bigger picture issue here, like constitutional reform and a voice that needs to be addressed first?
Well, look, I think native title, despite its shortcomings, has created the opportunity to, around procedural rights, the right to be engaged, the right to be, to have a say in certain things. I don't know if that's the total answer. I kind of feel that if the real issue is, and Emma really made this point, it's the relationship that Australia has with its people playing an important role. That can manifest itself in so many different ways around, other areas where people can be empowered. We know that if a big part of our social and socioeconomic issues and those statistical deficiencies around how we don't have opportunities, for example, around the Indigenous economic development space. And, there are agreements that are being struck, mining agreements or state agreements that provide a process to support social benefits or developments. But one of the things I'm mindful of, and I'll try not to be too long about this, is that we know that the Australian government has looked at other models. For example, when I've spoken some years ago with the previous treasurer in Australia about setting up trust models. And the first initial response was, well, hang on, we can't change the laws of Treasury or the rules of what have you. And I said, and I had to give examples about saying, well, actually, Australia's been involved in helping set up trust modelling in Papua New Guinea with the Barrier Reef Marine Reef Trust. There's heaps of other examples. And so sometimes, if Aboriginal people, I think the message has been clear. We don't want a handout, we want a hand up. And so if you help us to empower us to be, because a lot of Aboriginal people are saying we have the answers, as Emily spoke about. There's different approach for different areas, not one size fits all, but Aboriginal people generally are saying, let us be a part of the solution, the work that was done on empowered communities. On Indigenous people driving policy reform, understand the value that Aboriginal people can have in providing a lot of the solutions or the answers. And I just gave one example about economic development, but obviously this is a far greater or more reaching, a greater reaching in terms of what the potential of it is.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right, Uncle. It's got to be multiple systems. One size does not fit all Indigenous experiences across Australia. And so for where native title can be worked and strengthened, let's do that. For where it can't be, let's look at other options. And this is what, for me, voice is so critical, because we have multiple solutions. And there's fear that our peoples are here to cause some kind of harm is found to be untruthful, because we're here to participate and learn and say, once we've got that law sorted, go away, do your jobs. We've got trust. And that's important, that every option, every model builds this trust and the voice together.
Thank you, Emma. So from my perspective, there are two things. I'm a believer in the native title process, but as Emma has so well pointed out is that that's only the first step. It's the first step to recognition, and there's the majority of First Nations people in Australia who cannot access that first step of recognition. So that's one challenge. And the other challenge is, I'm under no disillusions about what the native title framework is set up, and it's essentially a system designed to legitimise dispossession. And so myself and others who are immersed in that space, we are on a daily basis. I mean, I missed another meeting today, which is basically a discussion with a mining company over them taking tenements on our country, where native title is designed to take our land and give it to a third party, and we get some form of compensation depending on the graciousness of the third party as to how much we get paid for that act of dispossession. So on a daily basis in Western Australia and elsewhere, native title is designed to dispossess Aboriginal people within a legitimate, legal framework. Now, there are challenges. We are specifically precluded from economic opportunities within the Native Title Act, and so those sort of things need to be addressed. Fundamentally, I wanted to come back to the question of the voice and constitutional reform, and I think I may be way out at a tangent here, but editing a broken document seems to be a waste of time. And what we really need to be focused on is actually a negotiation between the settler state and the First Nations on an Australian Republic, where we talk about and we write a new constitution that basically establishes our relationships on an equal footing, enjoying recognition, enjoying protections, but also aspiring to a future nation that addresses the issues of the past and creates an opportunity for all of us to go forward on a foundational basis that inspires and brings us all together. So thank you.
Thank you all. I guess this question probably goes back to you again, Cato, but others obviously may want to comment. Many people have been shocked at the Rio Tinto destruction at Juukan Gorge. Yet, as you said, Cato, this is an example of practices that have been happening for decades, especially in the Pilbara. Why do you think this particular event grabbed so much public attention? Has the Black Lives Matter movement generated some of the energy that might be required to finally see some meaningful change in this area?
The cynic in me would suggest that it was a poor news day, and the media outlets were sick of the lockdown. But the campaign, the fight to protect country, has been ongoing from the day, here in Western Australia, the settlers stepped their foot on, off on the Swan River. My elders fought against the Weibo Stones battle, which led to the introduction of the Aboriginal Heritage Act. So that was way back in the 60s, and it was a very brave stance for them to take back then, because in their generation, any resistance from Aboriginal people would be met with by brutal force. When they stopped shooting our people, they started shooting our dogs, and thereby taking away our capacity to engage in, sustenance and economic activities. So I think it's a narrative that is ongoing. So Black Lives Matter is ongoing. We have had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody here, and I think there's something like 200 to 300, I can't remember the figure, but I do know I have a lot of family who have died in custody since the Royal Commission. So the conversation, the discussions are ongoing, and it's, we do get a spotlight and an opportunity like Jukan, and I think what Jukan reinforced, and it's probably a problem of Rio's own construction, because they represented themselves as being the user-friendly mining company who was sensitive to Indigenous needs, and I think that's what the reaction was to come back and say, well, hey, you guys, if you're the best that we've got, we'd hate to see what the worst is doing. And I think that's the reminder for everyone out there, is that by its very nature, mining is extractive and exploitative. But the real problem comes back to who are financing these projects? Where is the money coming from? What are the checks and balances against those financiers in terms of measuring the impact of their investments? And then, of course, the complicity of states and governments in that economic activity. At the end of the day, I, as an Indigenous, First Nations person in Australia, I'm very much aware that the economic model in Australia is built on accessing our land and our resources and shifting those resources, creating capital in other parts of the world to sustain ways of life for a lot of non-Indigenous peoples. And what my elders or our elders have done is to fight to get to the table to be able to access a small portion of those resources. But at the end of the day, First Nations people in Australia are still relegated to, socio-economic marginalisation. And, I wasn't going to mention this, but Maguire is resigning as the president of Collingwood Football Club. And in the AFL, which has been a very, a forum in which a lot of our people have engaged, we still don't get that acceptance. And there's still institutional barriers to participation and equality, which needs to be broken down. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Cato. Emma, maybe this is a quick Indigenous people managing country more and more, and that can be with native title or in jointly managed national parks or protected areas. That could be without native title. But the key question is, are sufficient resources being made available to allow repair to degraded country, and are sufficient resources being provided to ensure the proper maintenance of countries' environmental and cultural values?
Well, no, because depends on money so often. And I believe that this is more about relationships. I mean, when you think about the gains that we have made as First Nations peoples, I don't see a huge amount of wealth happening there to be able to become human under constitutional recognition, or to manage, land programs through, unlimited supplies of GPS. Our peoples have done what we have done with literally no resource, monetary, beyond our cultural resources, our cultural capital of our shared beliefs, our shared understanding, our shared genetic links to each other and country. So for me, it's not about the economic side of resourcing. It's about providing and expanding out the areas that we can participate together to do this. This is why I believe the voice is so important, because this isn't, and while it's about Indigenous people speaking to Parliament, for me it's a reflection of the support of so many everyday people to say it's not good enough. We need to have Indigenous knowledge as helping lead our recovery. We need to have Indigenous cultures repairing those broken relationships we have with people and place. So for me, it comes back again to that strength and the characteristic of the relationship that needs more attention, and how everyday people, and now these new, beautiful, gorgeous generations who are coming up now, both white and black, who see the rightness of our approach. To me, they are the resource that we must focus our energies on to help us in this massive change, because we're not going anywhere. Indigenous peoples have survived the most extraordinary, massive climate change. I mean, I'm in Tasmania. A part of our oral histories, remember when it was a land bridge between Victoria and Tasmania. We know about the flooding, and we don't go, and we never leave country. You might want to go. Genocide is offers, but that's not going to happen. And so it's nothing to do with money. This is everything to do with walking together, working together, hearing together, speaking together.
Thank you. Nolan, this is one that you might pick up. You've already talked about some of the environmentally sustainable development opportunities that you see existing for native title holders in the Kimberley. But what else do we need to embrace? What sort of opportunities do you see sort of in the future for native title holders that would complement urgent action on climate change? And I guess I stress here urgency, because we know that we really need things to happen quickly if we're going to meet some of those Paris targets that you referred to.
Yeah, look, for sure. I think I'll probably lean towards trying to get a sense or understanding of what are the low-hanging fruits. We know, for example, if we're looking at an industry opportunity, that Indigenous people and Australia has a lot to offer. It's in terms of the wealth and the economics, if that's what drives the country's priorities, that Indigenous people and the oldest living culture in the world. The science around this, I think, in the territory is established something like 60,000 years now. So it's well beyond 40,000 years. So when you think about tourism and you think about Australia and you think about the economy, Aboriginal people and significant places, could contribute to a major part of the helping people to find the means to sustain themselves and address some of their issues and capability and capacity. But the other is that to have value to the Australian economy. We know carbon abatement, we looked at that as an example. I think that you're always going to get savanna fires across northern Australia because of the fuel load density with the rainfall and everything else. And so I think there's something like a $40+ million industry opportunity right there with Indigenous people doing carbon abatement work. There's we've got examples with our ranger groups that are doing fee-for-service contracting work to Australian quarantine services. We've got they can also be involved in tourism. You've got Australian biosecurity contracts. You've got Aboriginal people are there and they're doing this work and they have these obligations anyway. Why wouldn't you take advantage of this, particularly if you're talking about coastal areas, or not necessarily coastal areas, but anywhere that requires these biodiversity, environmental and conservation activities that Aboriginal people are so closely linked to because of their connection to the country. There are advantages to be had around this stuff. So I like to think that in terms of sustainability and a solution, you can kill two birds with one stone. It's not a good analogy, but it's really about saying, look for the low-hanging fruit and understand the value that Indigenous people bring than the mere token recognition as traditional owners or people in this country that aren't treated respectfully. If you look at the institutions that promote and perpetuate the circumstances of our mob. And I think Emma really spoke to this as well, that Australia has a lot to do if there was any kind of movement on this to get to the other point, and that was that Australia needs to help to heal the relationship that it has with Indigenous peoples in Australia. All the mechanisms and systems and legislative frameworks and that are creating these outcomes, something has to be done. The need for a voice so that if this is about Australia listening or the government listening, the country as a whole really needs to hear, because people are not ignorant of the fact that there was this history in Australia, and Aboriginal people have been dragged through this amidst all of the, you hear people talk about intergenerational trauma that's been perpetuated. If you don't deal with things, you have the same symptoms that you're dealing with that continue and persist. So there are ways around it. And as I said earlier, Aboriginal people have some of the answers for this. So when you create relationship, you really also need to be able to listen to what Aboriginal people are saying, to listen what our leaders before us, to listen to what Aboriginal people have been saying for years and years and years and years, going right back in history. It is not complicated. It is really simple messaging. And that could really fix a lot of things if Australia embraced this. There are lots of good non-Indigenous people. We're a multicultural society now. We're rich in our culture. That we should be proud of this. And there are really good Australian people out there. The majority of Australians really want a country that they can be proud of. But in order to do that, they must make reparations, or they must heal or help to heal the process or the history with Aboriginal people. That's not difficult to do. It's how do you put aside the position that you hold because you're defending something that just helps to maintain, and boys, the same old. You just really have to say, look, there's value with Aboriginal people, one way or the other, and I've given examples of that, and you hear other examples. There's a lot more than I've spoken about, where Aboriginal people can play a major part in the contribution of this country we call Australia, and we're all Australian. So, this relationship is about one people, the Australian people.
Here's a audience question for you. It's really the sort of question that I hate getting, but I'll pose it anyway. What is the most encouraging development you've seen in recent years to progress the rights of Indigenous people? And I guess I'll start with you, Emma, and you might like to respond to that first.
Oh, it's like a grab bag of goodies. I'm not really quite sure where to begin because, deep in my heart, I'm a cynical person. Externally, it's about fabulous and celebration. And so, for me, I've come from being told my whole life I don't exist to now being celebrated in a state constitution. But I do think, Professor, seeing Indigenous editors on conservation standards with the International Union Conservation of Nature. So these are the big guys, in the UN room. These are the people who set up there's laws, regulation, policy that has excluded our people ever since it began. And so to see them change where, you know, Indigenous peoples were only really welcomed into global things like the Convention on Biological Diversity and conservation in about 2003 with what's called the Durban Accord from the World Parks Congress. So, you know, in 20 years' time, we've gone to, oh, there's no way we're letting any of those people in the door, to like, actually, your knowledge is complex, enduring, and a desirable characteristic of what we want our future country and conservation to be. So I'm, you know, I wouldn't want to live to 100 years, but I can't wait for the next 10 and 20 years to see absolute leaps and bounds of what's happening.
Kada, would you like to have a go at that question?
Yeah, sure. I think the most fundamental thing is the capacity to engage in dialogue without fear of retribution. We enjoy a way of life in Australia that many other First Nations and Indigenous peoples just don't have the capacity to basically wave the flag and point to the deficiencies in the system. And so there are so many things that we need to celebrate by being Australian and living in Australia. One thing that I thought I would highlight, it's been coming up on my LinkedIn feed, is the young 6-year-old girl who's now 66 years old in the US, who went to the first, non-segregated opportunity at school. And I started to think about that example, and here, and I think in Western Australia, it was Roban School, which was one of the first to allow Aboriginal kids to attend school. And that's within not so much my generation, probably just a decade before I came on the scene or was born. But being able to access those opportunities, education, and this is something I do tell my kids, because being a kid that went to high school in the 80s, I actually was one of the first cohort of generations able to access and go from kindy through to high school. But I do pose a caution to that, in that what we have lost also is that my elders and my ancestors were all tribal people who come out of the bush, and they were immersed in traditional Aboriginal education. And so sadly, what many of my contemporaries, I'm fortunate in that I straddled both those fields and became literate in our sort of own language as well. But that has been denied to a lot of my contemporaries in going through this journey. So in every time we get an advancement or a right, we need to be careful to ensure that we don't lose something in that process. So yeah, that's my observation. Thank you.
Look, if in recent years, I would have to say, because we were already touched on a voice for Indigenous peoples, now it's heating up, and things are becoming more, people are becoming more aware of it. But it is not new in the sense that if I'm talking about 10 plus years since the conversation started, through a process of bipartisan support for this to be seriously looked at, and started, I think, when Howard was in government. But there's been processes like this consistently going with expert panels, different committees appointed. I think back when Gillard was in the chair, there was all the way through to the dialogue, and now the the latest process that Emma talked about, engaging on a voice as well. So that's kind of, for me, that's probably one of the most important ones, because the Constitution is the highest rule book for Australia. There are lots of issues with it because it doesn't properly recognize Aboriginal people. And if you look at the symptoms that we have around all of the things that are happening to us, all of the indicators that are there, the social and socioeconomic, all of the systems, mechanisms that work against us, then you have to go to the course. And the issue is that when there is this recognition, I can remember when the apology was made, and sorry, people were so worried. It was, oh, look, we shouldn't apologize, or what if we apologize, then we'll have to pay all this compensation. And that's not the issue. This is about saying there is a push, a direction from back in history, Aboriginal people saying the same things. And then when you get a process, if you want to call that development, where people finally get to realize and say, you know what's wrong? The Constitution does not reflect Aboriginal people in a way that gives rise to the way we are treated, and the symptoms about that exist is because some fundamental thing needs to happen at a different level. We can't if you keep doing business the same old way, guess what? You'll get the same old result. So for me, to cut a long story short, the best development I've seen is with the conversation, because then it's where you have a responsibility of government who holds account for its constituents, for its Indigenous peoples, and all of its issues. That's a different story, because it means that development is about starting to head in the right direction, about saying, what is it that we need to do to change the circumstances of ourselves as a country, having issues with our Indigenous people that is embarrassing sometimes, where we've had statistics, on different areas and health that are sometimes comparable to a third world country, or a developing country, as they call it now. So there are all these things that, if nothing else, if people aren't embarrassed by them, take heed or take the advice of what our government has been doing when in the last 10 to 14 years, talking about, through a bipartisan process, that there needs to be a change in our Constitution to reflect Aboriginal people and a voice in the Constitution and to Parliament. That's the most significant change for me.
Thank you very much. Look, a final question to you all, just to bring it back to the climate emergency and global warming. Could you make just a brief statement about how climate change is going to impact on your communities? Nolan, you've already spoken about poverty and the likelihood that Indigenous communities will be impacted most.
Heat being experienced in our communities. We're seeing rising seawater up in the Torres Strait. We're seeing, there was this process. The other part of the question was, the answer was about saying, our people on the ground dealing with managing country are starting to notice things as well. Lots of groups have developed in partnerships with different proponents or government agencies around seasonal calendars. And when they put these seasonal calendars together, they talk about how is that based on what happened over a period of time and seasonal changes and all that sort of stuff. So when you talk to a lot of our old people and our elders that way back then could see all these things happening, they're being involved in research, talking about this, their knowledge, the traditional knowledge about, well, we used to see certain things happen in this season, and we'd see, when it was time for hunting or gathering or whatever it was, those seasonal calendars are telling a story. My understanding is that people are going through telling that story and noticing significant changes. And I think the science communities have engaged with those communities in different areas in their research and starting to hear some of this as well, let alone the actual Western science research that are also telling different things as well.
Thank you. Kado, you live in a pretty hot part of the continent. I wonder if you'd comment on that question.
Yes, I will. I will follow with Nolan's comment about the Torres Strait as well, given that they're experiencing sea level rising and all of that. And I think a lot of the viewers should familiarise themselves on some of the actions that they're taking up there to try and address these issues. Back home here in the desert, the two observations I'd have. One is we are no stranger to climate change. Our traditions, our oral histories talk about the changes that have come before, particularly the emergence of the deserts themselves, which are a consequence of the glacial activities during the last ice age. All of that is documented and recorded both orally and visually, and also in our rock art throughout Australia. Essentially, we have rock art that tells these stories, and I think that's one level. There's a conceptual dialogue that needs to occur between the cultural / spiritual domain and the rational scientific domain that whitefellas engage in. And what's going on in a lot of these dialogues between two-way science, etc., is a process of cherry picking and a bastardization of our insights and our knowledge systems, where science as a teenage system of knowledge is coming in to cherry pick the gems of our understandings of the world, the universe, the environment, etc. And I think if we're looking at a reset, we need to reset on a common ground of understanding. And I think the capacity for Western intellectual systems to engage on a common ground with First Nations and Indigenous intellectual systems. We do have a lot of the answers. We have preserved these answers from observations from multiple generations and thousands of years beforehand. And I personally see it play out here on our land in the desert, where the changing patterns of where rain travels. Once we'd have rain coming from up in Nolan's country, and it followed a set course through our country. Those patterns are changing. And what we need to do is have the opportunity to engage in that cultural, spiritual conversation on the ground, away from fear of cherry picking and bastardization of our knowledge systems, to then be able to come up with effective solutions. And I think that's the opportunity that First Nations and Indigenous people present to the world, is we do have a system of knowledge that may well solve all these problems. The challenge is for industrialized Western rational minds to come and sit down and engage with us on common ground.
It's definitely an emergency. I mean, our peoples have been able to manage the adaptation to change over time. It's happening much more rapidly, and so believe me that there's no division, there's no separation between Indigenous and other Australians in terms of understanding what's required, because we both share those concerns around uncertainty. Yet believing in country and knowing those ancestors, and every day watching our midden sites along the coast getting washed away with increasing tides, I put my faith back into people everyday ordinary people, that we've got this, and that our younger generations have too, because country needs us. And if we lose that ego about what we think, what we might lose, and start to think about what country gains, and we pay very close attention to her, I think we'll get a truer, straighter path on this. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our speakers, Kato Muir, Nolan Hunter, and Emma Lee. Thank you for joining us. Good night and stay safe.